This is the second in a two-part series covering the printing of a reductive relief block. The jig and paper should already be prepared. Because of the nature of reductive prints, you cannot go back and reprint layers because they will be carved away in stages. Begin carving the linoleum. Carve only the areas you want to stay the color of your paper. In this case, white. If you don't have any areas that you want to stay this color, you may skip this step and move to printing. As you carve, it's helpful to have your original drawing close by for reference. This is the plate with only the white areas carved. It's ready to print now. Begin by printing the weakest color first. For this plate, that's a transparent green. Here I'm using ink that I mixed ahead of time. Homogenize the ink by mixing it and moving it around. Lay out a thin strip of ink with the knife and roll out a square using the brayer. Remember to lift the brayer at the end of each pass so different sides of the roller are making contact with the ink. When setting the brayer down, always set it roller side up to avoid damaging the rubber. It is a good idea to build a habit of always wiping down the packaging tape, even if it looks clean, just in case any ink or fingerprints were deposited there. Check that the back of the paper is facing up and the print side down. Having an X marked on the back helps. Then, keeping the paper elevated above the plate, pop the pins into the holes. Carefully lay the paper over the block. If you're using a press, be sure the pins enter first. Be careful not to smash the pins with excessive pressure or by using pins that are taller than the linoleum. Here is the first layer. Much of this will end up being covered by additional layers. You must print this layer for the entire edition before moving on to the next step. Rolling on the proper amount of ink is ideal, but when unsure, it's better to err on the side of less ink than too much ink. Sometimes the additional layers can mask a little under-inking, but if you apply the ink too thick, it will squish out, and that cannot be hidden under additional layers and will lead to thick, shiny, unpleasantly textured prints. Hang on to prints that don't turn out well. The ink on this one was just a little too thick, but it can be used as a test print for future layers. Once finished, print the excess ink off the block. You may need to dampen a paper towel with just a little bit of baby oil and lightly dust the surface of the plate to see your image. Never pour baby oil directly on the plate as it does not evaporate and will pool in the carved areas. Extra ink can be saved by laying out a piece of cling wrap over the edge of your workspace with 2/3 of the plastic hanging off the side. Scrape ink off using the corner of the table. Fold the plastic over and carefully press out any trapped air. Roll the plastic up and then twist the sides to make a Tootsie Roll. The side of this can later be cut and the ink forced out using an ink knife. Tie the ends so they don't come undone and then secure them with tape. Always label saved ink because it all looks the same. Now carve away the areas you would like to stay the color you just printed. Every time you carve, you are preserving what is already on the paper. So, because I just printed light green, I will carve away everywhere I want to stay light green. At this point, there's no going back. Now that you're carving again, the first layer is permanently altered. Again, it's helpful to keep the original drawing on hand so you can reference any notes or alterations you've made along the way. Here is the plate with the white areas and the light green areas carved away. It's ready to be inked for the second color, medium green. Do not print the second layer until the first is completely dry. This will take at least a day or two if you're using oil-based inks. If the prints are wet, the ink from the second layer could rip the first layer off the paper. You can speed up the drying by setting a fan near the prints or adding just 1 drop of cobalt dryer to the ink. Be aware, however, if you add cobalt dryer, you won't be able to save leftover ink. I typically don't do this as I often like to integrate ink from the first layer with later layers. As more of the block is removed and more empty space appears, try balancing the brayer between raised areas to avoid accidentally inking the carved spaces in between. Rolling the ink onto the block should be a gentle process. Using pressure can damage the brayer. If you feel the need to push, recharge the brayer with ink instead. Here is the print with the second layer printed over top of the first. Once more, the entire edition must be printed before moving on. Off-print the excess ink, buff with a tiny amount of baby oil, and carve the last layer. You can see how the block is becoming further reduced. As with the layers before it, the plate should not be printed until the prints are completely dry. Now that the medium green layer has been carved away, the plate is ready to be inked with the final color, dark green. I didn't do much color mixing for this print. The first layer used about 90% extender and 10% green ink. I saved what was left from the first run and added in a little more green for the second layer. I did the same for the third layer, but threw in a tiny bit of black as well. Using the press to print is easier on the hands and allows for consistent, predictable pressure. With relief blocks, you can remove the felts and use a cutting mat in their place to provide a nice cushion that doesn't push the paper down as much, making it less likely that ink in the carved away areas will print. As more material is carved away, keep an eye out for ink getting down into the lower areas. If this happens, you can use a paper towel to wipe it off, or cover the spot with tape right before printing. Reductive reliefs can be printed by hand. It's just a little trickier to hold the paper in place as more and more of the block is removed. Securing the corners of the paper with blue tape helps prevent it from wiggling around. With the paper in place, use a spoon and a decent amount of pressure to rub the back side of the print and transfer the ink onto the paper. Here is the final print. The plate has been reduced, and so you can see how it would be impossible to go back and pull another edition at a later date. The MDF can be salvaged and used again. Begin by removing the packaging tape and pins. Lay a sheet of newsprint over the block and heat it with an iron until the linoleum loosens enough for you to pry it up using an ink knife. Apply heat as you go, progressively pulling more of the linoleum off the block. Use an ink knife to scrape away glue and debris until the surface is completely flat. Do not use this side of the MDF as a jig if it has ridges or bumps, as they will alter the pressure in some areas. If the surface is completely smooth and flat, this can be used again. If not, you can always flip the block over and use the other side as a jig, or carve it for a relief print. Now that the edition is dry, it's ready to be trimmed down. If the measurements were correct, you should be able to remove those extra 2 inches that were added for the punch registration and still have a 2-inch border all the way around the printed image. Here is the complete edition, ready to be signed and designated.